Did you know that corn, alfalfa, potatoes, broccoli, tomatoes, papaya, soybeans, and sugar beets are all examples of foods that are genetically modified? For those of you who don't know what a genetically modified food is, by definition, genetically modified foods are foods produced from organisms that have changes introduced into their DNA using the methods of genetic engineering. In other words, these are foods that have been chemically enhanced for improved quality. The first genetically modified food the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved to be sold in stores was the Flavor Save tomato in 1994, according to the GMO Inside. The purpose of genetically modifying this tomato was to increase longer shelf life by delaying the process of rotting. There are many controversies related to genetically modified foods, but the main concern of the public is whether or not all GM foods should be labeled in stores. Some say it should be required, some say it shouldn't, and some say they don't care. A study done by the Mellman Group in 2012 showed that 87% of people in a national registration-based sample were in favor of labeling genetically modified foods. To validate the increase of those in favor of labeling, another study done in 2016 by ABC News showed that 93% of about 1,000 Americans polled agreed that the federal government should require labels on all foods saying whether it's been genetically modified. Genetically modified foods are constantly being discussed due to the fact that there are both pros and cons. Some may think that the cons outweigh the pros, and therefore it is necessary for them to be labeled. Others may think that the pros outweigh the cons, and therefore it does not matter if it is labeled. According to an article written on Newsmax Health, the benefits of genetically modified foods include potentially producing higher crop yields and feeding more countries. This can also lead to improved quality and taste.
Administration could determine was that the salmon grows faster. Nutritionally, it's identical to salmon that is grown using conventional techniques.
Another advantage of genetically modified foods are that they reduce the needs for pesticides and herbicides as well as pollution and greenhouse gas, making a safer environment for animals and insects. Genetically modified foods can also eliminate seeds, thus producing a long shelf life. Moving from the advantages, genetically modified foods come with disadvantages that carry concerns. A major disadvantage of genetically modified foods is that they have the ability to trigger allergies in people. Because genetically modified foods are crossed with genes from different organisms and foods, people with allergies can become severely affected.
I have a son who has severe food allergies, and he got the food allergies back in 2009, August 25th, 2009 to be exact. And I have literally, from that day forward, have been on a mission trying to figure out how did my son get these food allergies. I found out that our food supply is genetically modified. And guess what? The food that my son ate on August 25th, 2009 was raw corn. The corn that almost killed him.
While there is no conclusive link to genetically modified foods, the National Center for Health Statistics notes that allergies in children under 18 have risen from 3.4% in 1997 to 1999 to 5.1% in 2009 to 2011. Additionally, the emergence of new diseases can become a huge problem, being that it will be difficult to find a cure. Genetically modified foods could also prove to be toxic to an organism, therefore reducing the number of that organism or even causing extinction. Damage to the environment can also be done by genetically modified foods, because livestock is raised in abnormal conditions. The genes in genetically modified foods may also migrate into other organisms. The result of this is that some genes are not meant to be transferred into other organisms because that can cause harm to them. From a consumer's perspective, the public has the right to know what is contained in the food that they are buying.
I have the right to know what's in the food that I feed my family.
However, there is also the perspective of the manufacturer, which is companies have the right to keep that information confidential.
I think we need to test. I, as a farmer, need to know the answer. You, as a consumer, need the answer. If we keep it in the laboratory, we'll never know. Some would say that's where it should stay, but I believe we have to make progress.
Professor Hoover, an entomology professor at Penn State, shared her views on the idea of labeling genetically modified foods. Her own research on the matter has led her to conclude that there is no adequate evidence showing that genetically modified foods cause direct harm to the human body, and that the information given is, quote unquote, overly blown out of proportion. She didn't used to think genetically modified foods needed to be labeled because they weren't harmful to humans, but now she believes that they should in fact be labeled. She is opposed to some genetically modified foods because of the risks of allergies and crossbreeding side effects. However, she believes that breeding for plants is good for resistance and is good for disease. In contrast, there are some people who believe that genetically modified foods do not have to be labeled. In an article by Steve Serrier, an international economist, he states that, quote, because genetic engineering is a process and not an ingredient, end quote, the FDA should not be required to label foods that have been genetically modified. He agrees with the FDA's position on the notion that food should only be labeled if it contains, quote, a nutritional or food safety property that is significantly different from what consumers would expect for that food, end quote. In other words, if the food contains a protein or other element that can be categorized as an allergen that is not usually found in the non-GMO variety of that specified food, then it should not be labeled. According to that organization, Just Label It, as of 2015, it is required in 64 countries that genetically modified foods be labeled in stores. An abundance of research has been found regarding whether or not the FDA should require all food companies to label genetically modified foods. Many people express different views and reasons as to why it should or should not be labeled. From what we have explored, we have learned that the majority of the public is in favor of labeling these types of products. However, there is a common stereotype that anything genetically modified is harmful to the body. Individuals may assume that genetically modified foods are, quote, monsters, unquote. But generally, that is not the case. No matter what your income, lifestyle, and knowledge of the subject are, we can conclude that in the years to come, the labeling of genetically modified foods will continue to be a controversial issue. What would you prefer?